Welcome to Past People. To support my channel, please consider subscribing. The tumultuous life of King George IV. Born into the lap of opulence as the heir to the royal throne, surpassed the bounds of excess in an unparalleled manner. His actions, characterized by depravity, cruelty, and obscenity, stand out even in the context of the English monarchy. This narrative delves into the murky family secrets and the conclusion of this royal fate. Lavishly indulged childhood. George, born on the 12th of August 1762, was the firstborn to King George III and Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Despite his apparent charmed life, replete with regal privileges and extravagant feasts, the royal family concealed a dark and corrupt essence beneath the glittering facade. His father, King George III, earned the moniker the Mad King due to the recurring bouts of insanity. This condition necessitated George's assumption of the role of Prince Regent, marking the advent of the Regency period. Juggling this weighty responsibility might offer insight into the spectacular mismanagement that ensued. As George IV's reign concluded, his senior aide, chronicling the monarch in a private diary, spared no criticism. A more contemptible, cowardly, selfish, unfeeling dog does not exist. There have been good and wise kings, but not many of them, and this I believe to be one of the worst. Brace yourselves for a tumultuous journey through his legacy. Early on, Prince George exhibited unmistakable signs of debauchery. His numerous mistresses could likely have filled multiple royal chambers, and his penchant for revelry and carousing with these beauties surpassed his interest in politics and sermons. The extent of his transgressions, however, exceeded all predictions. Gambling ranked among George's great passions, but this infatuation didn't reciprocate. It nearly led to his downfall. Despite his considerable royal wealth, George amassed colossal debts from extravagant wagers on cards, horses, and practically anything with a price tag. Eventually, the repercussions caught up with him in a spectacular fashion. As any newcomer to university life can attest, indulging in brandies may enhance your social standing, but is decidedly unkind to your belt buckle. George, always carrying a bit of extra weight, saw his extravagant taste swiftly propel him into epic dimensions. In due course, his refined womanizing earned him the noteworthy and amusing title, the Fat Adonis. George's father, in a desperate attempt to steer his son in the right direction, devised a disconcerting solution. Before considering the forgiveness of any of Prince George's debts, the king insisted on his marriage to his cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. If this appears to be a perilous and dreadful plan, it undeniably was. Caroline, in her mid-20s, faced an unusually advanced age for women to marry at that time. Some attributed it to her strict parents, who prohibited her from attending balls or, God forbid, dancing at any of those galas, and even peculiarly banned her from standing near windows. However, according to others, there was an even darker reason for Caroline's delayed romances. A persistent and notorious rumour suggested that Princess Caroline of Brunswick remained unmarried due to unconventional behaviour. Whispers of the time implied that when Caroline was in her teens, she became pregnant by a peasant. To conceal the pregnancy, Caroline's parents rejected several proposals before ultimately marrying her off. Perhaps George had heard that rumour too. Prince George and Caroline of Brunswick had never set eyes on each other before agreeing to wed, leading to a disastrous encounter. Reportedly, when Prince George finally encountered his betrothed, his response was incredibly snide. The future monarch simply requested a larger glass of drink to numb his disappointment. Painful, but that wasn't even the worst part. Upon Caroline's initial arrival in England, George reportedly made a gesture of apparent honour by appointing her a lady-in-waiting, Frances Villiers. However, this turned out to be a cruel power play. Villiers was one of George's preferred mistresses, and by designating her as Caroline's Lady of the Bedchamber, he unmistakably communicated his priorities to his new wife. The narrative, however, did not conclude at this juncture. George's ineptitude in governing a nation contrasted sharply with his adeptness in the realm of fashion. Introducing various styles to England, many of them strategically designed to conceal his obesity, he abandoned the prevailing knee breeches in favour of looser trousers. Dark colours became popular under his influence, serving to create a slimming effect, and high collars were embraced to conceal his double chin. The royal union unfolded on the 9th of April 1795, but the fairy tale ceremony swiftly devolved into a nightmarish affair. Prince George commenced his drinking early, rendering himself thoroughly intoxicated by the time the ceremony commenced. He also voraciously declared to friends that Caroline was unsightly and unhygienic, and this was just the beginning, as they still had the wedding night ahead of them. When Prince George escorted Caroline to the bedchamber that fateful night, he made a horrific revelation. Upon assessing the situation, he strongly suspected that the blushing bride was not a virgin. While this lends some credence to the unsavouring pregnancy rumours surrounding Caroline, it's worth noting that George himself had not exactly spent his youth showing chastity. The bedroom dynamics between George and Caroline mirrored the dismal state of their overall relationship. The prince later asserted that they consummated their union a mere 3 times, twice on the wedding night, once the following evening, and thereafter never again. Despite his proclivity for womanizing, George penned, "It required no small effort to conquer my aversion and overcome the disgust of her person. Sometimes, however, 3 times is all it takes." Almost precisely 9 months after their ill-fated wedding night, Caroline gave birth to a daughter, Princess Charlotte. It's almost as if Caroline's biology was vehemently signalling "one and done" regarding her tumultuous marriage. Ultimately, Charlotte stood as the sole legitimate child that George would ever have, rendering her subsequent tragedy all the more poignant. Despite his questionable pursuits, George IV harboured an unexpected talent, an incredible, witty, and intelligent individual from childhood. Even those who despised him acknowledged his brilliance as a conversationalist, provided he wasn't excessively inebriated. However, his biting wit occasionally veered towards the inappropriate. Prepare yourself, as the saga of George IV is about to take an even more astonishing turn. While George and Caroline of Brunswick endured a miserable marriage, she remained oblivious to his darkest secret. On the day they exchanged vows, the prince was already married, and the scandal surrounding this revelation proved even more sensational than it initially sounds. Before Princess Caroline became his means of royal debt forgiveness, George IV was passionately entwined with Maria Fitzherbert, a double gasp, widowed, Catholic commoner, 6 years his senior. George, deeply infatuated, pledged to marry none but her. It might have been considered romantic if it didn't take such a twisted turn. In a clandestine ceremony on the 15th of December 1785, George secretly wed Maria at the bride's modest dwelling. If this sounds dubious, it's because it was. Decades earlier, Parliament had enacted laws making it impossible for a royal heir to marry a Catholic and requiring the king's permission for any marriage. In essence, George and Maria were in a bind. Nevertheless, they forged ahead. George IV concealed his sham marriage for years, fully aware that its revelation could ruin him and both Parliament and his father, potentially jeopardizing his throne. Nevertheless, both he and Maria regarded the union as legitimate, and she remained a significant figure in his life until the very end. As Caroline soon discovered, perhaps a bit too significant. In the realm of mistresses, George IV undeniably had a preference: mature women. Maria Fitzherbert was a woman of maturity. yet she paled in comparison to George's other paramour. Frances Villiers was 40 and already a grandmother when George initiated an affair with her in his early 30s. In fact, most of George's mistresses were witty, charismatic women many years his senior. Prince George struggled to navigate his love life, mirroring the chaos in his political realm. With King George III's escalating mental illness, Parliament advocated for Prince George to assume the role of regent as early as 1788, when he was still in his 20s. However, for some reason, most members of Parliament mistrusted the royal rake, and his ascent to power only occurred amid great tragedy. In 1810, a devastating blow struck the royal family. Prince George's younger sister, Amelia, succumbed at the age of 27. She had been King George III's beloved daughter, and her demise plunged him into melancholy beyond description. Heartbreakingly, it also marked the final stage of the king's debilitating mental illness. At that point, Parliament had no alternative but to appoint his son as regent. Predictably, the tumultuous relationship between Caroline and Prince George faltered after the birth of their obligatory heir, Princess Charlotte. However, George's ordeal was only beginning. To his surprise, Caroline garnered significant public favour, and when news of their marital woes reached the press, they portrayed her as a wronged wife, which in many respects she was. But after that, all pretences were abandoned. The brief period during which Caroline and George coexisted felt like an eternity of ceaseless torment. Frances Villiers, George's current mistress, took her role as Lady of the Bedchamber quite seriously. She delved into Caroline's private correspondence and aided George in exerting control over his new wife. The prince went so far as to deny Caroline the freedom to travel without his permission, and matters were about to take a darker turn. By 1797, Caroline had established a separate residence far from George, until scandal erupted. Whispers circulated that the king's wife was entertaining gentlemen callers during her newfound independence, prompting Parliament to launch the infamous delicate investigation into her private affairs. The findings were far from delicate. George immersed himself in the creme de la creme of English society, treating leisure with a gravity akin to an actual occupation, which it wasn't. Under his regency and reign, the concept of a seaside vacation gained prominence, thanks in part to George IV constructing his own seaside spa and palace in the Brighton Pavilion. Although the delicate investigation failed to conclusively prove anything against Caroline, it unearthed a trove of damning information, including suggestions of a secret love child born during her time apart from George. This provided George with ample ammunition for a ruthless retaliation. Consequently, he restricted Caroline's access to her daughter, Charlotte, to once-a-week visits. Why didn't Prince George follow in the footsteps of King Henry VIII and seek a divorce from Caroline? Well, he certainly tried. However, being just as culpable as her in matters of infidelity, any divorce proceedings would inevitably expose his own indiscretions. Despite attempting to push through a bill allowing him to separate from Caroline without investigation, it crashed and burned due to the widespread disdain from Parliament. Prince George associated with the most sophisticated circles during the Regency period, including the renowned dandy Beau Brummel. Possessing a razor-sharp wit and an even sharper tailor, the vivacious Brummel played a pivotal role in keeping the Prince Regent at the forefront of both fashion and revelry. However, the camaraderie eventually soured. During a ball, the Prince Regent, in a fit of pique, chose to ignore Brummel cruelly. In retaliation, Brummel elevated the snub to new heights. Right in George's presence, the dandy turned to a companion and rudely remarked, "Who's your fat friend?" This marked the end of their once warm-hearted and congenial friendship. In 1820, after the passing of Mad King George, Prince George ascended to the throne at the age of 57. It was his moment to shine, and he spared no expense to his opulent coronation. Describing it as lavish falls short. Party George's grand celebration incurred a cost 20 times higher than his father's coronation, which was also a staggering 10,000 British pounds. Small wonder why the American colonies grew so resentful of taxes. Credit where it's due, George IV possessed exquisite taste, albeit ruinously expensive. For his coronation, he insisted that all attendees don old-timey Tudor and Stuart period attire, even commissioning his own decadent red velvet gown. It became a resounding success, used in every coronation since George V. However, his special day was not without its share of high drama. George IV's pettiness knew no bounds, and he adamantly excluded Caroline from the coronation. When she returned to London to assert her rights as consort, George inflicted a cruel blow. Caroline reached the doors of Westminster Abbey, only to be met by guards brandishing bayonets under the Queen's chin before slamming the doors shut, and the ordeal didn't end there. To compound Caroline's royal humiliation, King George IV issued an official decree to expunge her name from the Common Book of Prayer at the coronation ceremony. To George, this likely felt like the culmination of his petty revenge against Caroline. Little did he know what lay ahead. Despite the persistent allegations of infidelity shadowing Caroline of Brunswick, she asserted that she had committed adultery only once in her life, with the husband of Mrs. Fitzherbert, the king. Caroline wasn't holding back. In the tumultuous aftermath of King George IV's coronation, the narrative takes a darker turn as we delve into the tragic and mysterious fate of his estranged queen, Caroline. Amid health challenges and personal tribulations, the monarch's life becomes a tapestry woven with suspicion, addiction, and an undignified demise. Following the coronation, a distraught Queen Caroline returned home and promptly fell gravely ill. Her condition steadily deteriorated, and 3 weeks later she succumbed at the age of 53. While her doctors initially diagnosed an intestinal obstruction, modern experts suggest it might have been cancer. However, Caroline harboured a much bleaker theory. During her final days, Caroline often deliriously claimed that she had been poisoned, a rumour that many at the time denied. Many inferred George's involvement in his wife's demise, though there is no concrete evidence supporting this theory. Nevertheless, the sentiment persisted. Upon ascending to the throne in 1820, George concealed his most disturbing behaviour yet. According to numerous historians, the monarch likely grappled with an addiction to the sedative laudanum. One undeniable fact was that George's morbid obesity, a condition that would play a role in his awkward downfall. In the twilight of his life, George faced a myriad of ailments, including dropsy, gout, arteriosclerosis, and severe cataracts that left him nearly blind. Virtually incapacitated, George had to endorse bills using a stamped signature in front of witnesses, far from the image of absolute power. In the waning years of his life, people begrudgingly admired King George IV, but for all the wrong reasons. Despite battling severe illness, he displayed an astonishing will to live and maintained an unabated appetite. In one memorable meal, he consumed a pigeon, a beef pie, over a bottle of wine, a glass of champagne, and a glass of brandy. One of the very few entirely complimentary nicknames bestowed upon George was the First Gentleman of England. People used this moniker to encapsulate his charm, wit, and cultural refinement, while conveniently overshadowing the less savoury aspects of his personality. On the 26th of June 1830, George IV faced his demise, and it was anything but serene. At 3 a.m, George awoke with an urgent need for a bowel movement, resulting in a large evacuation mixed with blood. The king immediately grasped the severity of the situation, realizing it was worse than he could ever have imagined. Summoning his doctor with urgency, George exclaimed, "Fetch him, this is death." However, the physician barely had time to enter the room before the king passed away. The doctor later recounted, "I was up in the stairs in 5 minutes, and he died but 8 minutes afterwards." The swift turn of events left everyone bewildered. The autopsy, however, unravelled the unsettling truth. Examination results disclosed that the king succumbed to a ruptured blood vessel in his stomach, embarrassingly occurring during a bowel movement. Yet that was not the sole revelation. The autopsy revealed an enlarged heart, a bladder tumour the size of an orange, and dangerously congested heart valves. Contrary to the expectation of a nation mourning King George IV, the response was quite the opposite. As one commentator expressed, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? Well, now I feel conflicted about feeling sorry for him." Despite banning Queen Caroline from his coronation, George's cruelest act didn't end there. In 1817, their only daughter, Princess Charlotte, died in childbirth, and George intentionally withheld this devastating news from his estranged wife. Shockingly, Caroline learned of the tragic event accidentally through a passing courier. Quite a despicable revelation. After the birth of George's daughter, Princess Charlotte, he promptly revised his last will and testament, leaving his royal wife a disturbing gift. 3 days post Charlotte's birth, George updated his will, bequeathing all his possessions to Maria Fitzherbert, "my wife," while allocating Caroline a mere single shilling. Now that's an unsettling bequest. Despite George's spendthrift ways, romantic escapades, and indulgence, his regency and reign proved to be an unmitigated disaster. Some historians propose a more unsettling reason for his failures. George may have suffered from the same illness that afflicted his father, porphyria. Regardless of the cause, the final years of his reign were far from picturesque. As we conclude this riveting exploration of King George IV's tumultuous reign, we are left with a nuanced understanding of a monarch whose life was marred by excesses, personal tribulations, and a legacy overshadowed by controversy. From the suspicion surrounding Queen Caroline's demise to the monarch's struggles with addiction and a tragic neglect of familial ties, the tale of George IV is one of complexity and contradiction. Royal facts about George V. The Victorian family of Queen Victoria was full of scandal and drama, and as the son of Edward VII, George was not void of this family drama himself. George was put forward into the front and centre of this drama, as well as having a tragic relationship with his controversial elder son, and that meant that George barely had a moment of peace in his life. George was born into his role of the spare heir on the 3rd of June 1865. His place of birth was Marlborough House, right in the heart of London. His mother was Princess Alexandra of Denmark, and his father was Albert Edward, the future King Edward VII. He was part of a large brood of children of 6, and despite his father being away on various rendezvous with many mistresses and women of the night, he lived in a privileged, large and luxurious mansion with his prince and princess siblings, and his parents were far from ordinary, and their arranged marriage was far from a fairy tale. George was the grandson of one of the most powerful people in the world, Queen Victoria. His grandmother's relationship with his father was strained, and she did not trust him with the royal duties 1 ounce. This meant that Edward had a lot of time on his hands and had to occupy himself somehow, and his hobbies were very controversial. Not only was he a disappointment to her, but she also blamed him for the untimely death of her husband, meaning she could barely even look at him. She took away all of his royal responsibilities and refused to allow him any involvement in the royal court at all. Although his father was able to have 6 children with his wife, for the majority of their marriage he was away, getting his end away. Despite his father's controversial behaviour and adultery towards his mother, George grew up in awe of his father, and he was mostly liked by the general public. Perhaps he was in awe of his father because he was blissfully unaware of his parents' double life. The childhood George was aware of was that of a happy royal family, but it would only become clearer as he grew older that his father was often absent for long periods of time. It is likely that he believed that his father was on official royal duties, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Prince Albert Edward eventually succeeded his mother and became King Edward VII, but before that he had another name, Dirty Bertie. His father was becoming a womanizer, and his wife had to accept that he would never be monogamous. She knew that he was sleeping around with mistresses, but she had to ignore it if she wished to be his queen consort and wife. It is believed that he had at least 55 mistresses, and those are just the ones that are known about. It was due to this behaviour that got him the nickname Dirty Bertie, which is not the best name to be associated with the future King of England. Bertie was unfazed by the nickname, and he continued to womanize his way through society with his 55 mistresses, as well as the prostitutes that he saw in the Parisian brothels. Yet for all his debauchery, Edward was remarkably discreet, and more often than not, the society gossip could only guess at who was sharing the prince's bed on a given night. Prince George was not originally destined to be the King of the UK, but tragically the death of his eldest brother, Prince Albert Victor, meant the crown fell at his feet. George was a second-born son, and there was only a year between the boys. They were educated alongside each other, with neither one gaining the title of a star student. Their father was also a young boy who did not get on with the royal education system, and so when it was evident that his sons were not interested either, he shipped them away from home in a bid to make real men of them. The Prince of Wales believed that the best way to become a royal man was to join the Royal Navy, and George's father sent both him and his brother off for training when he was just 12 years old, and 3 years later, at the age of 15, the pair of them entered service on HMS Bacante. His life on the ship did not involve active combat, and instead could resemble a holiday, travelling the world, than a strict boot camp for boys. Aboard the ship, George and his brother travelled the world together. They were privileged to visit the furthest reaches of the British Empire, from the Caribbean to South Africa to Australia. In 1881, they visited Japan, where the teenage George made a scandalous decision to get a tattoo of a blue and red dragon on his arm. George and his brother had endured many interesting events together, but as Albert Victor was to be king, his life was to take a different turn to George's. His brother was enrolled to Trinity College to study while he remained in the Navy. He was now a lonesome man without his brother as his sidekick, but a new love would enter his life instead when he met the woman of his dreams. George began serving with his uncle Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh in Malta. He was the best placed to show him the reins of being the spare heir to the throne, as his uncle was also the second-born son. During this trip, his uncle had brought his daughter, Princess Marie of Edinburgh, with him, and Marie was George's first cousin, but this didn't stop him from falling in love with her. Strangely enough, the love match was approved by the royal family, with his grandmother, father and uncle all approving. For the royal family, it seems like a match made in heaven. At least, it did for most of them. Others weren't so happy about it, and that's when the scheming began. Join me in part 2 to delve into how George's love life took an even stranger turn, from falling in love with his first cousin to marrying his dead brother's fiancée. The cousins were getting on brilliantly, but not everybody was a fan of the love match, and some even despised the idea. George's mother and her sister were some of the people against the love match between the first cousins, not that it was because of this. They were just worried about the political problems the match would cause, and marriages were often a way to improve friendships between countries and political parties. It was George's aunt that put an end to the love match. she managed to persuade Princess Marie to turn down George's hand of marriage. She would not become the Queen of the United Kingdom, but she did go on to become the Queen of Romania. George was devastated, but his life was only going to take a further turn for the worst when he fell poorly. George had contracted typhoid. This was a scary concept for the prince's family, as it was rumoured to be the same disease that stole the life of his grandfather, Prince Albert. He was completely out of action for 6 weeks, while he recovered from the illness. He spent the time lying in bed and just praying for it to be all over with. Finally, his fever broke and the family were overjoyed. When George and his brother Albert Victor were separated, it did not take long for Albert Victor to spiral downwards. Albert Victor was gaining a reputation that no one in England wanted at the time. There were rumours spiralling of all varieties, including scandalous affairs with chorus girls, as well as controversial antics at a gay brothel. Albert Victor would become engaged to Mary of Teck, but due to tragedy, the pair would never go on to marry. Instead, there was a twist on the horizon. The pair were blissfully engaged for 6 wonderful weeks before the influenza pandemic hit and ravaged the royal court. The disease took over the body of Prince Albert Victor, who later died at the tragically young age of 28 on the 14th of January 1892. Albert was George's lifelong friend as well as his brother, and he had been tragically taken too soon. Not only had he died, but so had his prospects as future king. This meant that the role fell into the hands of George, and George was unprepared for this role and did not expect to take over the crown at all. Queen Victoria had spent a long time finding a bride suitable for a future reigning monarch, with Princess Mary of Teck, and she was not about to let this bride out of her grips. Queen Victoria therefore wished for Mary of Teck to marry George instead, and this was a strange twist of events, as she was previously married to his dead brother. Surprisingly, this match worked out very well for the pair. George and Mary must have struggled at first with the notion of marrying each other, when the pair envisioned completely different roles in their relationship. However, over the coming months the pair would grow to like one another, and they shared a deep grief for Albert Victor. 1 year after losing Albert, George asked Mary's hand, and she said yes. George and Mary of Teck had a dedicated and loving relationship. Their relationship in private was an affectionate one, but in public they appeared cold and distant due to George struggling with public affection. Their love was evident in the loving letters that they sent each other over the years, and pretty soon they would both need all the help that they could get. George and Mary would go on to have a large family together, producing many heirs to the throne. They had 6 children, 5 of which were sons, and 1 was a daughter. George allegedly gave a simple explanation of his fatherhood style. My father was frightened as his mother, and I was frightened of my father, and I am darn well going to see it that my children are frightened of me. That would certainly line up with what his son Henry would later say about him, calling George a terrible father. Maybe the kids resented the fact that George didn't give them the life that most royal families expected. George was entitled to live in the most lavish of palaces and castles in the UK, but instead he opted for a more humble small family home at York Cottage, a relatively small house in Norfolk. Despite being the next in line for the throne as the King of the UK, his appearance on the outside would make you believe that he was just an upper middle class family rather than the next king. Perhaps he loved this home so much because it allowed him to take part in his hobbies in the countryside. Queen Victoria was still alive, and so the crown was still very far away from George at this point. He was another man with a future reign, with a lot of time on his hands, and like Edward, he had some controversial hobbies. He was into shooting, and shooting animals too. He had plenty of time to kill, and he took that literally. As his official biographer put it, when he was the Duke of York, he didn't nothing at all but kill animals and stick in stamps. George's two great loves were hunting and stamp collecting, though one of those pastimes got a little bloodier than the other. When George became the Emperor of India, George and his wife took a trip through the Indian subcontinent, giving him access to many big game kills. During his 10-day trip, he shot 21 tigers, 8 rhinos, and a bear. He may have been rich, but you did not want to mess with George while he had a gun in his hand. George was becoming obsessed with his bloody hobby of killing animals, and one day he perhaps took it too far when he went hunting for a 6-hour stint on the 18th of December 1913. In that time, he shot 1,000 pheasants. That's one bird every 20 seconds, and once he was finished, even George admitted that perhaps he had gone overboard. "We went a little too far," he remarked. Join me in part 3 to delve into his life as king, as well as his German enemies, his involvement in World War I, and his betrayal of his family, which ended in their untimely, tragic assassination. When Queen Victoria passed away, his father was catapulted into power. The long-awaited role of king was his, and when he became King Edward VII, this made George the new Prince of Wales, and he would learn as much as he could over the years on how to become king from his father. The rest of his time was spent making and raising a family, as well as travelling the world. It is a good job that he was able to be educated on his future role as king, as his father was not on the throne for long. And his father's controversial habits had finally caught up on him. The years of eating, drinking, and sleeping were no more. Queen Victoria reigned over Britain for 63 years, but his father would only be king for a fraction of the time, with 9 years. He succumbed to illness on the 6th of May 1910, and George was devastated. He wrote, "I have lost my best friend, and the best of fathers. I am heartbroken and overwhelmed with grief." The death of his father did not take front and centre of his mind for long, as he had other things to worry about with the ongoings of World War I. On the 4th of August 1914, 4 years after George became king, he wrote a frank entry in his diary. "I held a council at 10:45 to declare war with Germany. It is a terrible catastrophe, but it is not our fault. Please to God it may be soon over." World War I was the most horrifying conflict the world had ever seen, and the politics of it were very close to home, with his own family members serving as enemies. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the figurehead of Germany at the time, and George and Britain blamed him wholeheartedly for the destruction on the world. Wilhelm was in fact George's first cousin. This was a war of families as well as continents. Strangely enough, George's ancestry was German. He came from the house of Saxe-Coburg in Gotha. It was difficult, therefore, for him to portray himself with proud national British status. Britons watched as thousands upon thousands of their fathers, sons and brothers went off to fight Germans, while a German ruled them. It did not go unnoticed by the public, and George knew that he had to do something drastic to change the narrative. He changed his family name from the House of Saxe-Coburg in Gotha to the House of Windsor by official royal proclamation. He convinced his other German relatives to take up the name too, with Prince Louis of Battenberg changing his name to Louis Mountbatten. The name lives on today, with the current monarchy serving under the House of Windsor, but George could not reform all ills with this statement. During a stressful period for George, his other first cousin was coming into trouble in Russia, when Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown by a dangerous and murderous family, the Bolsheviks, who had taken over the country. The government were quick to offer their support and help in the form of asylum for the family, but oddly, George heartlessly turned them away with devastating and fatal consequences. This was the ultimate betrayal to his own family. Rather than fuel a revolution in his own country, which is what George believed the Romanov family would do, he tragically turned them away. His cousin and his family were left alone to be murdered in cold blood, after several grueling months in captivity. Their bodies were dumped down an abandoned mineshaft. In 1918, the war ended, and King George, alongside his people, rejoiced with happiness for the first time in a long time. However, there would be tragedy on the horizon for George. Prince John, George's youngest child, was born in 1905, but from the moment of his birth, he was a sickly and frail boy. Little Johnny was the baby of the family, but no matter how much anyone spoiled him, his health just never improved. Finally, just 2 months after Amnesty, George's worst fear came true when he suffered a seizure on the 18th of January 1919 that he would never recover from. Tragically, at only the young age of 13, he passed away in his sleep. George and his wife, Mary, were both devastated, but part of them was relieved. John's entire life had been filled with sickness and pain, and in a letter George painfully described John's passing as the greatest mercy possible. It was George that started the Christmas tradition that we so eagerly await today from the current monarchy. In 1932, he sat down to address the nation for the first ever radio announcement from the monarchy on Christmas Day. This was not something he was overly enthralled to do, but his advisors reminded him that his people wanted to hear from him. And off the back of his announcement, the people felt connected to him, and he won the hearts of the nation, making him a beloved king, even if he didn't see it. In 1935, George celebrated his Silver Jubilee. Thousands of people joined the streets to celebrate the occasions with him. His radio address had allowed him to reach his people, unlike any monarch who became before him. When he heard the crown's adulation, he exclaimed, "I cannot understand it. After all, I am only a very ordinary sort of fellow." George was part of a large brood of siblings, and his older brother was the problem child, and this pattern repeated itself in his own children. George's relationship with his eldest son Edward grew more and more strained as the years went on, despite being close when he was younger. Now, oftentimes, fathers expect too much of their sons, but in this case, George was 100% right. Prince Edward was not the kind of guy to make a father proud. Join me in part 4 to delve into how his son took his adulterous and promiscuous behaviour of his father, as well as being involved in the scandals of all royal scandals. I will also look at how King George, his own doctor, euthanized him. George's son, Edward VIII, had a lot in common with his controversial grandfather rather than his upstanding father. He embarked on many affairs with married women, courtesans, and whoever else happened to catch his eye. Edward's antics disappointed George and the other royals, but they were glad that his drama was out of the public eye. However, this would not remain the case forever, and eventually he got himself involved with a scandalous woman who murdered her husband and threatened to bring down the monarchy. Edward VIII became entangled with Marguerite Alibert, and she was not the kind of person that George wanted his son sleeping around with. Marguerite Alibert was a French high-class prostitute who became the first lover of Edward, the Prince of Wales and heir to the British throne. She would later be at the centre of the biggest scandal of the times, and she was very nearly damaged the reputation of the future king and the monarchy. A series of events began to stop the scandal from getting out of control, and that is the interesting story of Marguerite Alibert, the prostitute turned princess turned murderer. Edward VIII is famously known for giving up the throne in 1937 in order to be with the love of his life, Wallis Simpson, who he was not permitted to be with because she was a divorcee twice before. This scandal was prevalent throughout Europe, but 20 years before, another scandal was taking shape. The affair was kept under wraps by the prince, and he only declared his feelings for his mistress on paper, but she kept them all. George used all of his power to ensure that his son's name never appeared in the press surrounding Marguerite Alibert. And although he almost succeeded, with just the odd rumours whirling, the public never learned that the Prince of Wales had an affair with a working girl who then shot her new lover. George eventually tracked down every last letter that Edward had written to Alibert and had them destroyed. But the damage was done, and George would never truly trust his son again. His eldest son caused him a lot of stress, but he did have another son who he adored and respected. This man would go on to become the future king when his scandalous brother put his love with a divorced woman above his duty to the throne. He was also very fond of his granddaughter, Lilibet, known by the public as Queen Elizabeth II. She loved him in turn, affectionately calling him Grandpa England. He thought both of them would make excellent monarchs, if only they got the chance. Maybe George had a sixth sense for what would transpire, or maybe his disappointment in his son had created a self-fulfilling prophecy, but by 1935, George's faith in his son and heir had all but evaporated. He is reported to have said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. I pray to God my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." George had always been the epitome of health, especially as a young, strapping lad as a sailor. But the years as king took his toll on him, and he had been involved in a few accidents that caused him poor health. The once hale and hearty king grew frail and sickly, and a painful tragedy only made things worse when he lost his favourite sister. During World War I, his horse buckled and threw him to the ground, causing serious injury from which he never fully recovered, alongside smoking many a cigarette throughout his entire life, and those took a toll on his health. George had been extremely close to his eldest and late brother Albert Victor, but he had also another sibling of which he adored, and she was his little sister Victoria. In December of 1935, when George was at death's door, Victoria suffered a hemorrhage and suddenly passed away. Her loss sent the king into a spiralling depression from which he would never recover. By January 1936, only a month after the death of his sister, George was still clinging on to life, but only just. He was now staying at the country estate of Sandringham House, and he was getting more and more frail, which restricted him to just his bedroom. Finally, his doctors released a statement. The king's life is moving peacefully towards its close, and that it did. George passed quietly in his sleep on the 20th of January 1936, or so it seemed, but there was more to the story that was shocking. Lord Dawson of Penn was George's chief physician in his final days. He kept a diary from his time with the king, and it made for an interesting read. He kept them a closely guarded secret for the rest of his life. In 1986, his diaries were made public, and they revealed the king's last words, a mumbled, "God damn you," to his nurse. This was not the only thing his diaries talked about. Lord Dawson, a highly regarded doctor, had lied about that fateful night, as it would actually appear that his own doctor euthanized him. The entire world thought that George had passed from natural causes because that is what they were told, and no one would have questioned that something much more shocking had happened. However, Dawson was an avid believer in euthanasia, and so he took it upon himself to end the king's life in a bid to give him a kinder, less slow and painful end. Dawson knew that George's end might take hours or even days, and he saw the toll that it was taking on the king's family. So he made the decision to kill the king. He injected him with morphine and cocaine. 15 minutes later, George's breath slowed, then stopped. Upon his passing, George's son Edward became King Edward VIII. But not only did George not see a leader or a king in his son also didn't fancy it either. George thought he'd make a terrible king, but apparently so did Edward. Before the year was out, Edward abdicated his throne so that he could marry his divorcee partner, Wallis Simpson. He was then free to live a life of high fashion, German sympathies, and extreme prejudice, while his younger brother became King George VI. So King George got what he wanted in the end, when his second son and then granddaughter would reign over Britain. Expressive insights into George VI, the king who didn't want to be king. The greatest honour lies in serving others. King George VI of the United Kingdom. George VI earned the moniker Reluctant King when his elder brother Edward VIII abdicated the throne in 1936. Known for navigating the challenges of World War II and being Queen Elizabeth II's father, George's reign, spanning only 16 years, left a significant mark on modern British history. Beyond his well-known speech impediment, his reign was marked by health issues and wartime tribulations, making him a distinctive figure in the annals of British monarchy. Explore the accuracies and inaccuracies of the King's speech, delve into his stance on Hitler, unravel the tragedies he employed to overcome his stammer, and even uncover the mysteries behind wardrobe malfunctions during his coronation. Here are some facts shedding light on King George VI. Upon his birth, the future King George VI was named Albert Frederick Arthur George. However, this name did not find universal approval. His maternal grandmother, the Duchess of Teck, foresaw a different destiny, expressing hope that his last name might replace the less favoured one. Among intimate circles, he was affectionately known as Bertie. Ascending to the throne as the fourth in line, Albert chose his fourth name, officially adopting George VI, to emphasize continuity with his father, George V. Despite his reluctance in assuming the role over his older brother, George aimed to present a facade of normalcy. Despite his privileged upbringing, George's childhood was marred by health challenges. Apart from his well-documented stammer, he grappled with chronic stomach issues and was characterized as easily frightened and somewhat prone to tears. Additionally, he wore corrective splints due to his knock knees during much of his youth. Contrary to his health struggles, George was very athletic in his youth. He even participated in the men's double tournament at Wimbledon in 1926, a prelude to his eventual kingship. Graduating at the bottom of his class at the Royal Navy College, Osborne, in 1911, George proceeded to Royal Navy College, Dartmouth. His progression, despite academic challenges, was facilitated by his father's royal status, making examinations a mere formality. Although George served during World War I, his involvement in combat was limited. His persistent health issues, including ulcer problems, necessitated surgery in November 1917. At 25, George earned the moniker Industrial Prince when his father tasked him with representing the Crown on tours of coal mines, factories, rail yards, and other industrial sites. George displayed a genuine interest in the working conditions of his subjects, serving as president of the Industrial Welfare Society. Before ascending to the throne, George held the courtesy titles of Duke of York, Earl of Inverness, and Baron Killarney. His eldest brother, the future Edward VIII, claimed the title of Prince of Wales, leaving George with these three titles, at least for the time being. George attended Trinity College, Cambridge, where he studied history, civics, and economics under the renowned historian R.V. Lawrence. Unfortunately, his academic pursuits were cut short after a year, when his father deemed George's skills better suited for representing the royal family on tours, diverting him from his studies. During his 1939 tour of North America, George forged a strong relationship with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. These bonds were believed to play a crucial role in shifting North America away from the isolated stance in the early stages of World War II. George proposed to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon 3 times before she accepted. Bowes-Lyon cited concerns about the significant lifestyle changes that come with being a member of the royal family as her reason for hesitation, a very valid consideration. Initially, the BBC sought to broadcast Prince Albert and Elizabeth's wedding live on radio. However, the clergy at Westminster Abbey rejected this idea, and the couple married off at the airwaves on April 26, 1923, avoiding the spectacle of a media circus surrounding royal weddings. The King's speech highlighted George's prolonged battle with his stammer. A failed speech on Halloween 1925 led him to seek help from Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue. Through breathing exercises, George's oral fluency significantly improved, although he never completely conquered his stammer. Upon King George V's death, Prince Albert's brother ascended to the throne as Edward VIII. Albert became the heir presumptive since Edward was unmarried with no children. However, Edward's determination to marry Wallis Simpson, an American socialite with 2-time divorcee, led him to abdicate in favour of love over the crown. When Edward's abdication created the need for a new monarch, George was not the sole candidate. With 3 living brothers in 1936, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, emerged as a potential successor. Due to Henry being the only brother with a son, as opposed to George, who had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, discussions arose about appointing Henry for the sake of male continuity. In 1931, Canadian Prime Minister R.B. Bennett proposed that Prince Albert assume the role of Governor-General of Canada. The suggestion, involving such a high-ranking member of the royal family, stirred significant controversy and was ultimately rejected by George V, Albert's father. George deemed that Edward had relinquished all royal titles, including Royal Highness, by abdicating the throne. While George bestowed upon Edward the title Duke of Windsor, this designation did not extend to his wife or any offspring. Before stepping down, Edward VIII was slated for a coronation at Westminster Abbey on the 12th of May 1937. Although this plan never materialised, the same date was repurposed for George's coronation. George VI's coronation marked a departure from tradition by having his mother, Queen Mary, in attendance, providing much-needed support to her son. At his coronation, George's crown was mistakenly placed on his head the wrong way, leading to an awkward fumbling of the royal headwear by the Archbishop of Canterbury. George's opportunity to wear his crown nearly slipped away. Even before the Archbishop misplaced it, the Dean of Winchester stumbled while carrying the crown of St. Edward's to George's coronation, nearly causing significant damage. Fortunately, the legendary headgear was secured to a cushion by a ribbon. During the 1940s Blitz on London, the King and Queen of England narrowly escaped death at Buckingham Palace when 2 German bombs exploded in the courtyard. The Queen's defiant response, "I am glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel we can look the East End in the face," resonated with the public, solidifying the royal family's image as steadfast allies during World War II. Starting in September 1940, King George and Prime Minister Winston Churchill convened for a private and candid lunch every Tuesday to discuss the ongoing war. This practice endured for 4.5 years. In a departure from tradition, George allowed Winston Churchill to join him on the balcony at Buckingham Palace during the victory in Europe celebrations of 1945. Under George's reign, the British Empire formally dissolved, giving way to the Commonwealth. Consequently, George became the inaugural head of the Commonwealth. George holds the distinction of being the final king of England to bear the title Emperor of India. Following the partition of British India into India and Pakistan in 1947, George adopted the titles King of India and King of Pakistan. While he relinquished the title of King of India upon its transition to a republic in 1950, he retained the title King of Pakistan until his passing. The health challenges that plagued George from his youth persisted into his adulthood. Prolonged chain smoking took a toll, resulting in lung cancer. In 1951, George underwent the removal of his left lung, casting a shadow over the king's ailing health. In 1949, George faced a serious threat to his right leg due to an arterial blockage, compelling him to postpone his scheduled tour of Australia and New Zealand for urgent surgery. On the 6th of February 1952, King George VI peacefully passed away in his sleep at the age of 56. Elizabeth, his successor, received the news while on tour in Kenya and promptly returned to Britain to ascend to the throne as Queen Elizabeth II. During their wedding, Elizabeth, George's bride, placed her bouquet on the tomb of the unknown warrior. The symbolic gesture, commemorating her lost brother Fergus, has since become a tradition followed by every royal bride. While George and Elizabeth enjoyed a happy marriage, their honeymoon had its challenges. Elizabeth contracted whooping cough in Scotland, adding an unromantic twist to their early days together. Did the King's speech therapist ever use profanity in the presence of His Majesty? Contrary to cinematic portrayals, Lionel Logue's grandson expresses skepticism about such behaviour. Additionally, he firmly believes that his grandfather would never have addressed the king as Bertie as depicted in the King's speech. George provided financial support to his brother Edward during the latter's exile. However, Edward would frequently call George, seeking additional funds and pressuring him to bestow the title of Duchess upon Wallis Simpson. Eventually, George instructed that the ex's king calls not be connected, marking a royal version of being left unread. Before significant royal speeches, George VI and Lionel Logue practiced tongue twisters to help mitigate the king's stammer. Their bond persisted until the king's demise. Lionel Logue, renowned for his work on the King's Speech, was so esteemed by the royal family that he maintained correspondence with the Queen Mother even after George's death. Upon Logue's demise in 1953, just a year after George's, the Queen and Queen Mother sent royal representatives to attend his funeral. Can you hear me? Ironically, George VI became the first monarch to address the public post-coronation via live radio. Speaking deliberately to overcome his well-known stutter, he remarked, "Never before has a newly crowned king been able to talk to all of his people in their own homes on the day of his coronation." While Edward VIII was the first royal family member to pilot an aircraft, George VI became the first fully certified pilot among them. True to his character, Bertie adhered to the rules. Born during Queen Victoria's reign, George's birth coincided with the 34th anniversary of the death of his great-grandfather, Prince Albert, Victoria's cherished consort. Despite the joyous occasion of a new baby, George's family faced anxiety about sharing this day of mourning with the reigning matriarch. To ease Queen Victoria's concerns, they named the baby Albert. In an alternative reality, Elizabeth II might not exist because her father would have married an Australian woman called Sheila, Lady Loughborough. George harboured deep feelings for Loughborough, but the situation was complicated as she was already married. The infatuation came to an end in April 1920, when George's father offered him the prestigious Dukedom of York to sever the connection. In the same year, George ended his interest in Lady Loughborough. He fell in love with his future wife, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. It seemed George was smitten with her from the very start and was determined to make her his wife. Less than a year after ascending to the throne, Edward VIII abdicated December 11, 1936, leaving it to his younger brother, the future George VI. George, for his part, was a hesitant king. The day before the abdication, he wrote in his diary about breaking down and sobbing when informing his mother of the news. George's early reign was profoundly influenced by World War II. Constitutionally bound to support Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, George endorsed Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Adolf Hitler. In a gesture of solidarity, George and his wife Elizabeth broke tradition by allowing Chamberlain onto the iconic balcony at Buckingham Palace. This close association with Chamberlain's Nazi appeasement had been deemed by some historians as the most unconstitutional act by a British sovereign in the present century. In conclusion, the life and reign of King George VI were marked by a series of extraordinary events, from the unprecedented circumstances surrounding his coronation to the challenges of World War II and his pivotal role in the formation of the Commonwealth. The intricacies of his royal relationships, health struggles, and the impact of historical events on his monarchy reveal a multifaceted journey. Despite the reluctance with which he assumed the throne and the constitutional dilemmas that he faced, King George VI left an undeniable mark on British history. His resilience, commitment to duty, and contributions to global diplomacy, especially during times of war, solidify his place as a notable figure in the annals of British history.